On this episode of Classic Gaming Quarterly, let's read the premiere issue of Nintendo Power from July and August of 1988. In the very first episode of Let's Read, we took a look at Nintendo Fun Club News issue number 7 from June and July of 1988. And that was actually the last issue of Fun Club News because they were switching over to Nintendo Power. Fun Club News was a complimentary publication that you would get sent in the mail simply by sending back like a registration card that you would get with your Nintendo. And what they ended up doing was sending this first issue of Nintendo Power out for free to anybody that was already getting the Nintendo Fun Club News. And so that's why this issue says free sample copy. There's actually two versions of this magazine sort of floating around, and the other one says something like free poster inside. That would be if you bought the issue off of the newsstand. Like you can see here, it says $3.50. The cover here has this plasticine Mario with Bowser in the background, and that was actually a common thing. For some reason, Nintendo Power kind of shied away from using drawings or paintings or whatever, which was something that was very common with like GamePro and EGM. But Nintendo Power used to, for some reason, want to use photographs, either of like a live actor dressed in a costume, or oftentimes these plasticine scenes. And I pulled out a few other magazines off of the shelf just to show. Like here's Mega Man 2 cover, and you can see Dr. Wily is sort of a plasticine Dr. Wily there. Here's Super Mario Bros. 3, again with the plasticine figures. And then here's Dr. Mario. And I think you can actually kind of see a progression. I don't know who they had on staff there that was doing these, but certainly I would say they got better. Because this one is, it's better than anything I could do. I admit that freely, but I'm just saying the artist that they had doing these things got better at their job. And then just as sort of a little historical point of interest, in case there's anybody out there who's not aware of this, Nintendo Power ceased publication in December of 2012, so about 4.5 years ago, and they actually recreated this cover for their last issue, and I have that here. And it, at least from the looks of it, it looks like they stuck with that plasticine, unless somebody just did like a really good job of recreating it, in some kind of a 3D rendering software. You can see that this particular issue is quite well read. It's pretty worn, but it's all here, and that's what's important. So just turning to the inside cover here. They've got sort of an ad. It's telling you that you can call the Nintendo hotline to talk to game counselors. Notice that it is not a 1-900 number. Now, it is a long-distance phone call, so your parents were going to pay for that, but you could at least say that Nintendo wasn't trying to make any money off of gamers by setting up like a 900 number or a 976 number. Interestingly, I thought, they were available from 4 in the morning until 8 o'clock at night. So as much as it would have been cool, I think, to be a Nintendo counselor back in the day, I'm not sure I would have been willing to get up so early that I was at work at 4 in the morning in order to do it. Here's the table of contents. As usual, we're not going to spend any time checking that out. So now we get to the Super Mario Bros. 2 section. And I wanted to use this just as a springboard to just talk a little bit about Super Mario Bros. 2. Super Mario Bros. 2 went through this period for a long time where it was sort of maligned. Like, I think maybe once it became like common knowledge that Super Mario Bros. 2 didn't start off its life as a legitimate Super Mario Bros. Game, I think it kind of got some shade thrown its way, for lack of a better term. And it was kind of the redheaded stepchild of the series. And I really can't say how it's regarded now, maybe by younger gamers. I can only really say how we felt about it back then, which is kind of why it bothered me that this game went through this period where I felt like it was not well regarded. This game, now this issue is from, as I said, July and August of 88. So this game actually was not out yet when this magazine came out. So this, and this is many pages long. And so it was a really big teaser for this for this game. Super Mario Bros. 2 came out in, I believe, October of 1988. When I was a kid, when Super Mario Bros. 2 came out, this game was a really big deal. This game and Zelda 2 were like the two must-have games of that Christmas season. At the time, I don't think any of us were really questioning the fact that the game was so different from the original Super Mario Brothers. Like, to us, it was just like the graphics were so much better, the music was so much better, the sound effects were better, you had 4 playable characters. You know, later it kind of came out that this was just a graphical hack of Doki Doki Panic, and, you know, maybe some people took that in a bad way and just decided this is not a legitimate Super Mario Brothers game anymore. I would say that it has sort of become one, in that, you know, characters like Birdo and Shy Guy have become part of the Super Mario Brothers universe. And of course it's important to note that the game was co-developed by Shigeru Miyamoto's team. So it's not like Nintendo went like off the farm and just took somebody else's game and licensed it and called it Super Mario Bros. 2. I mean, it was a game that they developed together with Fuji TV for a TV series in Japan. When they released the Japanese version of Super Mario Bros. 2, it was actually Nintendo of America that saw that and said, no, like, we don't want this here. We don't think it's going to go over well here. I think that Nintendo of America was very cognizant of what had happened with the video game crash, and they wanted to be careful not to start going down that same road. And releasing a sequel that looked the same and played the same. Now, obviously, that game is much harder. That game introduces things like the poison mushroom, but at the same time, it's not any kind of real advancement forward that consumers could go out and spend $50 on and then feel good about it, like, oh, this game is great. And so then Nintendo of Japan came up with the idea of reworking Doki Doki Panic and bringing it here as Super Mario Bros. 2. Now, this game went on to be one of the top-selling games on the Nintendo. It sold about 10 million copies and was so popular here that it was actually re-released in Japan. Now, Doki Doki Panic was a Famicom Disk System game, and it was re-released on cartridge in Japan, where it was called Super Mario Bros. USA. Now, here, again, this is basically a preview or a teaser to get kids interested in the game. You can see here they talk about the 4 playable characters that you can choose from. You have Mario and Luigi, as well as Toad and the Princess. Now, I was always, as a kid, partial to Luigi. I'm not really sure why, except that I felt like the way he jumped was more forgiving, because he sort of floated in the air in such a way that you could course correct more while he was airborne. And, you know, as I've said many times in the show, I was not good at video games when I was a kid, so that was definitely helpful. Here they kind of go over how to play the game, learn how to jump 3 different ways. Of course, you have the power squat jump now, where you can squat down and then you can like jump much higher in the air. This is just a normal jump, and then the running jump. Both of those, of course, were in the original game. It's the power squat jump that's sort of new. And then down here they talk about how now you can pick up items and throw them. Of course, that was new. And that could be like ripping one of these radishes or whatever they are, turnips, out of the ground. Or you could jump on top of the Shy Guys and pick them up. And then over here they talk about like the POW blocks, where you can defeat all the enemies on the screen. You've got your bombs, picking up enemies. Or now, of course, you could pick up a turtle shell and throw it, and it would still slide like it did in the old game. Showing the different items you had in the game, like the smaller sprouts. They just say vegetables. Like I said, it's either a turnip or a radish, I guess. What else could it be? And then just showing some of the other items. I'm not going to go through everything. And then going through all the enemies, which are all new. Now, I should also point out, you know, This game has really almost nothing in common with the original Super Mario Brothers, but Nintendo explained that away in the intro, if you ever watched the intro to this game, by basically saying that Mario was in a dream world. Like, he fell asleep and was having a dream, and this whole game is his dream. So, here you have all the different enemies. Of course, you don't have your Goombas and your Koopas and whatnot, because you have all these other little enemies. Of course, as I said, Shy Guy and Birdo ended up becoming series regulars. And then I just thought this was kind of cool. This just seems kind of like the kind of thing that you would have sat in class and drawn instead of paying attention. Of course, this is much better, but Super Mario Brothers 2 Sports Festival, it says, and it's kind of cool because you can see that it looks like it was colored in with just colored pens. But you've got like Princess Peach over here doing the long jump, which makes sense because in the game she has that long jump. And then here's Luigi doing a high jump, same reason. And then Toad's over here doing sort of like a shot put because he was the strongest character. And then I guess Mario just runs the fastest, so he's the one going around the track. And then we keep going. Now it kind of gets into a walkthrough, which, again, I kind of don't like this only because this was months before the game came out. And so in a way it kind of spoils the game. But, maybe once the game did come out, if you were a 10 or 11-year-old kid, you might need something like this to help you sort of orient yourself with the game. But I don't really see a reason for us to go through it in any great detail. But we've got World 1-1, World 1-2, World 1-3. So like I said, it really goes on for pages and pages. Then you get into World 2, which had sort of that Egyptian desert theme, 2-2, 2-3, and then that's it. So that's as far as they take you. Once you get past that, you're on your own. Then we get to the next feature here, which is Zelda: The Second Quest. And by this time, when this game came out, I think I had beaten the first quest. I will say that to this day, I've still never beaten Zelda's second quest. I guess I just don't really see much of a reason. All they really did was change around where like the stuff is. Like, it's still the same overworld map. It's just that now the dungeons are located in different places and the secrets are located in different places. So to me, it's kind of a lame way to add replay value, but because you were still going to probably need to use a guide. So really, what's the point? And then here they're just showing you where all the levels are located. You can see it has a little map where it's showing you which screen the level's located on, and then you have maps for every level. And then I think it's only the last two levels that they actually don't show you. Yeah, level 7, level 8, they don't show you where those are located. Although I think they might show you later, and then there's level 9, they don't show you that either. And then they give you just a little teaser for Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, which, like I said, was about 5-6 months away when this issue of Nintendo Power first came out. And then the poster that was sort of referenced, I think it said it here, said somewhere that there was a free fold-out poster. But like I said, if you bought this issue off the newsstand, it would say free poster inside. And that's just this, which on one side, I have to open it carefully. This has actually been taped together. And the tape itself is so old that it's yellow. I was not the one that taped it together. You have the complete strategy map for Zelda's second quest. And then on the other side, you have like this baseball poster thing because they're going to get into the baseball roundup. So that's it for Zelda's second quest. So then we get into the baseball roundup. And basically all they're doing is they took 3 baseball games, Bases Loaded, Major League Baseball, and RBI Baseball, and they're just going to sort of compare all of them. So the first one they talk about here, they have it kind of split into like categories. Like, so this is just general info. So the first here they have Bases Loaded. Now I remember Bases Loaded from when I was a kid because my best friend Jonathan had an older brother who was about 4 years older than us, which makes him seem like an adult. Like 4 years when you're a kid is a huge amount of time. And his name was Jordan, and Jordan was like a huge sports guy. And so he was really into Nintendo, but he was mostly into playing sports games because like we were 10 or 11 years old. So he's like 14 or 15. And one of the games he spent a ton of time playing was Bases Loaded. And what Bases Loaded kind of had going for it that made it different than other games of the time period was this behind the pitcher view. The only other game I can think of that had that view was Hardball, which at this time, was only available on home computer. Now, for that reason, I've personally never gotten into bases loaded, but some people certainly don't mind the fact that it looks like that. It is more realistic for sure. It's more of a TV style presentation. I think it makes it a little bit harder to play. The other two games, Major League Baseball and RBI Baseball, have just sort of that traditional, isometric behind the batter view. Now, obviously, Major League Baseball had a Major League license, so it had all the real team names. But it did not have a license from the Players Association, which RBI Baseball did. So RBI Baseball doesn't have team names, it just lists cities, but it has real player names in it. Both of the games are fairly cartoony. They're more of a stereotypical NES baseball game, whereas you can see in Bases Loaded, the player figures are a lot more realistic looking. I personally don't think much of Major League Baseball. RBI Baseball is a decent game, and Bases Loaded is as well. It's just, for me, I think there's quite a bit of a learning curve, especially with batting, because you really need to get your timing down. Now, what they do to help you with the batting is that the ball casts a shadow on the ground, and so that kind of helps you track the ball and see when it's getting closer to you, so you can kind of learn when to time your swing. As I said, this is split up into these categories. Here they talk about team management. Over here they talk about pitching, and this is pretty weird artwork. That looks like something that would have appeared in like Mad Magazine or something, but it's a little bit on the creepy side, actually. I don't want to spend much more time than that, just because I know that sports games are not something that most people are interested in. Next we get to Counselor's Corner. So if you're not familiar with Nintendo Power, Counselor's Corner was a place where readers could write in with questions. Now, remember, this is back when there was no internet. And so if you didn't have a guidebook and you didn't have some kid at school that you could go to and ask questions, you may very well be stuck on something until you could get an answer from like the game counselors. So first here we have two questions about Ghosts and Goblins. Is there a stage select? Which, yes, there is. And also, how do I beat the Red Devil, who was sort of that mid-level mini-boss in level 1. And they give him the trick where, you walk until you can just see the Red Devil on the right-hand side of the screen, and then you throw a spear at him or throw a lance at him and then quickly go back the other way. I can get that to work about half the time, personally. And then the stage select is certainly nice. I think I had to use that when I did the sort of mini-review, if you will, of Ghosts and Goblins for the channel. Down here you've got some question about Ring King. I'm not excited about Ring King. I played Mike Tyson's Punch-Out first. That was like the first boxing game I ever played in my life. And once I played that, pretty much any game that's not a Punch-Out game has always paled in comparison as far as arcade-style boxing games go. Over here we've got Metroid. And somebody just says, I have a hard time finding the power-up items. Like, they don't know how to find any of them or something, I guess. And so they show this whole map of basically the entire game, showing you where to find everything. Like, here's some bombs, here's the ice beam, long beam, high jump, etc., etc. So that's pretty helpful. Over here, we've got a question about Super Mario Brothers. Well, two questions, actually. Now, they've got this, the famous unlimited or whatever one-up technique, where you jump on the shell of the Koopa Troopa coming down the stairs. Now, I have never in my life actually done that. Now, I will say I haven't ever actually tried that hard. Like, I feel like Super Mario Brothers is easy enough and gives you enough extra lives that this just really isn't that necessary. But I guess it would have been cool to pull it off when I was a kid. And then the other question that they ask, somebody asks about the significance of the fireworks and how to set them off. And then over here you've got Castlevania. Now somebody says, no matter how many times I try, I can't seem to beat the 5 boss characters. You can't beat any of them, really? And then they just point out that each boss character has some kind of weakness that you can exploit. Like with Queen Medusa, it says she can be stopped by the watch. The holy water is also an excellent and easy way to kill her. And then, Frankenstein, Dagger, Firebomb will take the spring out of his step. The Grim Reaper and the Count shoot him in the head with a boomerang. Down here we've got Ikari Warriors. Is there a secret built-in continue or stage select? And they talk about, there's a stage select, but I never used that when I was a kid, but I used the continue a lot. You might notice if you ever play Ikari Warriors that after you lose your last life, the game kind of hangs around for like 3 or 4 seconds before you actually get the final game over and it tells you to go away. And that's because it's giving you time to type in the continue code, which is just ABBA. So I used to play this game a lot when I was a kid. It was one of the games I owned. And so I used to ABBA it quite a bit. And then lastly here we have Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. Somebody just needs some tips on how to beat Mike. Completely understandable. Obviously, that's very difficult. And then down here, they've just got something telling you to write in. Here's the address and the phone number if you want to just call the game counselor's hotline. And over here, we have this comic for Howard and Nestor. And so I just wanted to use that to just sort of quickly talk about Howard Phillips. Not to be confused with Howard Lincoln. I guess Nintendo of America was the land of the Howards back then. But so Howard Phillips was this guy that started off just working in the warehouse at Nintendo and basically worked his way up to being involved with the Nintendo Fun Club News and later Nintendo Power and just sort of becoming this almost cartoonish character that kids were supposed to be able to relate to. Like, yeah, Howard's an adult, but he's just a big kid. And, there was this whole rumor about how, Howard owns like 300 Nintendo and Famicom games. And he was the one that would make the final decision about what games would be brought out here because, he was like this gamer that just really understood what American gamers would and wouldn't want. And this Howard and Nestor, now Nestor obviously is just a fictional character. Of course, his name comes from the Nintendo Entertainment System. This comic, if you want to call it that, was really just a way to sneak a few more tips into the magazine. Like you see here, it says, hi, I'm Howard Phillips, president of the Nintendo Fun Club. And here they're talking about Zelda. So, like, I guess Nestor is supposed to be like the stereotypical kid that might be reading this magazine. So, like, Howard here is saying, oh, playing Zelda today, I see. Have you found levels 8 and 9? And Nestor saying, oh, I'm just messing around. I know where they are. Like, I don't need your help. But I bet you forgot where they were, because really the kid needs to know where the levels are. And so it's just Howard saying, oh, level 8 is here and level 9 is there. Because, of course, those levels are much harder to find in the game than the earlier ones. And so, really, it's just a way for you to read that and be like, oh, that's where those levels are, and then you can go play them. Next, we have, quote-unquote classified information. So this is just where they were listing off a few game tips. Some of them, I don't know why that's called like ooh, this is secret stuff or whatever, but like some interesting ones here. There's a sort of a cheat code, if you want to call it that you can pop into ice hockey so that you can play with no goalies, which seems kind of stupid. Like, it'd be cool if you could make the other team not have a goalie, but why would you want to not have a goalie? On the next page, of course, we have, and this is why I say, like, oh, classified information. Contra, build up your forces fast. So what are they telling you? Obviously the Konami code. Now, I had already played Contra by this time, and I can tell you that the Contra code, which is what we called it at the time, was very much common knowledge. Of course, that code made its NES debut with Gradius, because you could start the game, I think, with a fully powered up ship. But, when we were kids, it was like the Contra code. That's what it was known for. And I think now people call it the Konami code more. When we were kids, this code was indispensable because when you're 10, Contra's a pretty hard game. I think now it's really not that bad. And then down here we've got Gun.Smoke. Gun.Smoke is a game I had when I was a kid. Awesome game by Capcom. And this is just a way for you to power up your weapons from the get-go. Over here you've got Mike Tyson's Punch-Out and a code that you can put in to go to another world circuit. And then finally Arkanoid. Now, I don't have Arkanoid for the NES, and honestly, I wish I did. It had that cool controller you could get that had the little potentiometer on it. Arkanoid was a game I did play in the arcades. I also played it on computer. And then Arkanoid 2 Revenge of Doe is really good on the Super Nintendo and is actually compatible with the SNES mouse. So that's pretty cool. All right, now the next game we've got here is Double Dragon. And this is another iconic game from my childhood. It's something I sort of consider to be like the grandfather of beat-em-up games. Now, that's not literally the case. There were obviously quite a few beat-em-up games that came out in the early to mid-'80s. And it was actually the predecessor of Double Dragon, which was a game called Renegade, that really sort of set the mood that so many beat-em-up games would subsequently take. But Double Dragon kind of took it to the next level in a number of ways. You know, one of the things I kind of wanted to talk about was the importance of being able to play games two-player co-op when you were a kid, or even just two-player simultaneous. Because one thing you always hated doing was having to sit around and wait your turn to play a game. And that was one of the big appeals to me of the arcade, was that so many of the games were geared towards either competitive or cooperative two-player play, because that just allowed the arcade machine to take twice as many quarters in the same time period. And that was one of the big draws with Double Dragon, was being able to play the game two-player simultaneous. And for whatever reason, maybe because they couldn't get around certain technical limitations of the hardware at the time, Double Dragon, when it came to the NES, had that two-player simultaneous functionality removed, which was a pretty big deal back then. Now, Double Dragon was still a very popular game on the NES, although I shudder to think at how many people might have gotten this game because they thought they were going to get that two-player functionality, which unfortunately was absent. But even that being the case, this was a big-time game when it came out. And in fact, for a long time, I feel like subsequent beat-em-up games, because the term beat-em-up, as far as I know, didn't exist yet. And so you would describe those games as being, quote, like Double Dragon, because it sort of set the standard for beat-em-up. One thing they added to this game in the home version that I thought was kind of cool was this level up system. And they kind of touch on it here in this feature without really explaining it fully. And the very first tip they give you is, say, first try to increase your hearts. Now, hearts were basically experience points. And after you got a certain number of hearts, you would level up. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you go back to this page, they talk about all of the different moves that your character would have. Basic stuff like punching and kicking. And you have like jump kicking, low kicking, over-the-shoulder throws. The thing is, those moves were not immediately available to you. You had to earn them by leveling up your character, which I thought was pretty cool. And maybe, I don't know if this was the reason for that or not, one of the things they kind of go through here is how to kill enemies and like how to not kill enemies. Because I think if I remember correctly, yeah, here it's in stage 2, when this boss comes out, you can basically just throw him off of this conveyor belt and he just goes down a pit and dies. But then you're not getting all the hearts that you want to get. You know, you want to level up your character. Which, like I said, was just a cool thing that they added into the home version that the arcade version didn't have. I really don't know what their motivation was for doing that, but it did add a little extra dimension to the game that I thought was pretty cool. For somebody like me, the lack of two-player simultaneous wouldn't have been a big deal because I was primarily a solo gamer. But, you know, certainly if it was something you normally did with your siblings or with a friend that was constantly coming over, then having that two-player simultaneous functionality removed was going to be kind of a big deal. The rest of this is really just a walkthrough. You know, this was just common for Nintendo Power. You know, it was aimed at like, you know, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old kids who could really use the extra help that this provided. You know, obviously if you were a little bit older, maybe you didn't want all this help because you wanted to figure it out on your own. But, you know, I was, when this magazine was out, like I was right in that target audience. And so stuff like this was really helpful. But again, I would just say cool game. I always think of Double Dragon as being kind of a first generation beat 'em up game, although it's not. I mean, like I said, there are so many games like Black Belt and Kung Fu that are really just earlier iterations of the same style. So you could just say Double Dragon is like an earlier generation than like the Streets of Rage series, the Final Fight series, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles series like Turtles in Time. And so I think of its generation, Double Dragon was clearly the most standout game. Like, I remember when Streets of Rage was first coming out, I remember reading in like GamePro, that's how they described it, was that, oh, it's like a Double Dragon game coming to the Genesis. Then we get to this feature on Gauntlet, which I thought was really interesting because, you know, as you surely know, Gauntlet was a Tengen game. And when we think about Tengen and we think about the NES, we think, of course, about the Atari versus Nintendo lawsuit. So you might rightfully be wondering, why would a Tengen game be featured so prominently in Nintendo Power, like considering their legal troubles? But the thing is, this was from the summer of 1988, so this is right before all that stuff happened. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about this because the gaming historian, Norm Caruso, did a whole episode about this that's really good. But just to give you some broad strokes, Tengen was, of course, the home video game arm of Atari. So they were putting out games for the Nintendo and then later the Genesis under this Tengen label. And they never wanted to be Nintendo licensees. Like, as early as 1986, Atari was trying to figure out how to reverse engineer the NES lockout chip. Now, they tried and they realized that there was just no way that they were going to be able to do it. So they ended up biting the bullet and becoming Nintendo licensees. And so there are 3 game cartridges out there put out by Tengen in licensed form. And those were Gauntlet, Pac-Man, and RBI Baseball. What ended up happening, of course, famously, is Atari went to the United States Copyright Office and fraudulently got to take home a copy of the copyright application for the NES lockout chip, which allowed them to copy the code. At this time, everything was still rosy, only because Nintendo didn't realize what Tengen was trying to do behind the scenes, and they became aware of that just a few months later. Now, Gauntlet is another example of a game where I feel like this NES version is not well regarded by people. Like, I've read a number of negative reviews of the game, mostly I think because people compare it to the arcade game, which really with most Nintendo games is not a fair comparison. But speaking as somebody who played the arcade game at length back in the day, I can tell you that we enjoyed, at the time, this home version. Once again, we were only 10 years old, so we perhaps had somewhat less of a critical eye, but this was a popular game. Once again, this is a game that you could play 2-player simultaneous, which the importance of that just cannot be understated. I used to play this game all the time with my friend Jonathan, and we used to just have great fun playing this game together. It is completely different from the arcade game. All the levels are different, but you know, it's the same 4 characters, it's the same enemies. The game works the exact same way. It's just giving you like an entirely new Gauntlet experience. Here you can see they're showing you some of they call them rooms, the different levels here. With maps to them and you know, just giving you some tips as though you've never played the game before, like destroy the enemy generator. Well, that should be obvious, but you can imagine if you've never played the game before, you might not realize that you can do that. Here it shows you what some of the power-up items do, because again, that's not going to be obvious. But I think it's a cool game, especially 2-player. I actually just recently had a friend over to my house who'd never played this game before, and we got to play it together 2-player, so that was pretty cool. And then here, the hits just keep on coming. Here we have Contra from Konami. Now, I just finished talking about Contra on an episode of CGQ+, but it's an awesome game, so let's talk about it again. I'll at least kind of give you the broad strokes of what I discussed. Contra came out in the late winter of 1988. I think it came out in February. And I actually had a kid at school that I made friends with briefly who got this game sometime in the spring of 1988. Now, Contra was kind of my first introduction to the whole chip shortage situation. And it's kind of interesting because I feel like a lot of people think that the chip shortage was this artificial situation that Nintendo manufactured, right? That famous Nintendo artificial scarcity. Now, I do think that to a certain extent, the concept of their artificial scarcity is true, but the whole chip shortage that happened around this time actually was a real thing. There was so much demand for ROM chips, and there just was not enough supply to meet that demand, especially because Nintendo had very exacting standards for those chips. And it was very frustrating for third-party developers because, of course, Nintendo forced all of these companies to let Nintendo do all the manufacturing, right? Like, you write the game, you give us the ROM, we'll manufacture your cartridges for you. And so when Nintendo has that limited supply of ROM chips and has to start allocating them out, it's very frustrating for companies like Konami, who are putting out like blockbuster titles, but not being able to get enough copies of that game out to stores. And that was actually a big part of the reason that Atari ended up doing what they did with Nintendo. Atari had 2 hit games that had come out for the Nintendo, and that was Gauntlet and RBI Baseball, which are the 2 games that got covered in this issue. So obviously, they wanted as many copies of those games to make it out to the stores as possible because they wanted to have the supply to meet the demand, which they didn't. So that is what caused them to like go rogue and ultimately sue Nintendo because they wanted to break out of that licensee program and just make their own cartridges. My point with all that was just to say that Contra was a very hard to find game in the spring of 1988. I never saw one for sale anywhere. Like I said, this kid that I made friends with at school got a copy that apparently his dad had found at some store down in Los Angeles. And so I was pretty lucky to get to play this game. This may have been the first game that I ever got to play 2-player cooperative. I remember that being like the big deal with the game, is that me and this kid after school would go over to his house and sit in front of his TV and get to play this game together, 2-player cooperative. We used the Contra code that I just talked about earlier because, you know, we were in 5th grade, so the game was very difficult for us at the time. I think this game has held up very well. I still think this is one of the best games on the Nintendo, and it's one of those games I don't really ever hear anybody say anything critical about. It's just such a good game. Now, this was actually an arcade game before it came to the Nintendo, but I would argue that the Nintendo version is actually better. I think it plays a little bit better. Surprisingly, this is actually a pretty short write-up. It's just 4 pages. You just get this, and then it goes in a little bit more detail here. It gives you a little bit of backstory here into the game. You know, why what is happening. Not something I ever cared about as a kid. And they just give you a quick overview of some of what's going on. Like, you know, here is how to get power-ups, and then here they have sort of a map or whatever of the first stage, and then going up the side here is like a map of the 3rd stage. And then they just show a few screenshots of the later stages here, and then they actually do show a bigger screenshot from the final stage. That's not actually the boss, just for anybody who hasn't played the game to completion. I won't spoil it for you except to say that that is not the final boss, but it's from the final stage. But what a great game Contra is still. It's one of the games I go back to regularly on the Nintendo because I just love it that much. Here we've got NES Game Show games, and we won't talk about this too much at length, but they've got Wheel of Fortune here and Jeopardy. You know, I remember knowing kids that would have, you know, one or the other of these 2 games. These were, I think, just more family-friendly type games. You know, the kind of things maybe you could get your parents to play with you or something. The problem with these games is they never had enough, like, puzzles or questions or whatever in them. Like in the case of Wheel of Fortune, it didn't take you long to get to the point where you had seen all of the clues or whatever already, and you just had the whole game memorized. And the same is true of Jeopardy, where you were starting to get the same questions over and over again. But you know, I guess it would be a good bargain bin pickup, or may I just say, either of these games would be a respectable weekend rental, especially if you were looking for a game that you could play with somebody older. Next, we have video shorts. And the point of video shorts is that these are games that are either brand new on the market or are coming out, like, you know, imminently. So like new releases or will be out before the next issue of Nintendo Power comes out. So here we've got Legendary Wings. Now, Legendary Wings is a Capcom shooter from the arcades. You play like this dude, I forgot his name, but you play a guy with wings. It's got one of those two-plane things going on where you can shoot in front of you. You can also drop bombs on the ground. And then it also has some side-scrolling levels as well. Over here we have Iron Tank. Now, I talked at length about my disdain for Ikari Warriors when I talked about that game over on CGQ+. And Iron Tank is another SNK game, and the best way to describe it would just be, if you've played Ikari Warriors, you have those sections of the game where you can get into a tank and, you know, shoot other tanks, or when you can run people over. And that's Iron Tank. Like, I think someone just said, hey, let's take this and make it a new game. And it's funny because if you start playing Iron Tank, the music even sounds similar. Like the music has like the exact same percussion line with just like a different melody over the top. And much as was the case with Ikari Warriors, I don't think much of Iron Tank. I don't think it's a very good game. Down here we have Gun.Smoke. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, I had this game when I was a kid. Gun.Smoke was a game that I picked up at a video rental store. You know, and they would sell like their previously played games. I think I paid about $7 for it. Obviously, it was a few years later. Gun.Smoke is a really cool game. It's a Capcom shooter, but you know, instead of being in a spaceship or a flying object of some kind, you're a cowboy, and you're just, you know, walking up the screen, and you can shoot to either side, or, as I was not aware when I was a kid because I didn't have the instruction manual, if you press A and B simultaneously, you actually shoot straight ahead. Although I don't really find that to be that helpful. You know, in the arcade, it was a 3-button game, so it was just like, you know, left, center, right for the shooting. But as far as I'm concerned, they could have dropped the shooting straight ahead, because if you shoot from one side to the other, you've pretty much got everything covered. So that's always how I play the game. But really cool game. I like it a lot. Really cool atmosphere with the Wild West theme that it's got going on. Here we've got Rambo. Now, this Rambo is based on Rambo First Blood Part 2. And much like I said about Platoon in a previous episode of Let's Read, I'm kind of perplexed that they would choose to make a kid's video game out of a movie like this. Like, I watched Rambo First Blood Part 2 when I was a kid, and there's definitely parts of it that are a little bit sketchy for a kid to be watching. But this game is really not very good, and I would say maybe the most memorable thing or noteworthy thing about it to me is that during the cutscenes, you know, I don't know who did the pixel art. Like, they have a little tiny screenshot of it here, but I'll show you, you know, full size. Rambo just looks, he looks like a doofus. I don't know how else to put it. You know, I can't imagine Sylvester Stallone seeing that pixelized version of himself and thinking much of it. But yeah, and then over here we've got Metal Gear. Now, I rented Metal Gear at least once back in the day. It was, of course, put out by Ultra Software, which really just means it's a Konami game. And I rented it at least once. Of course, I didn't get the instruction manual when I rented it. And I was just never really able to figure the game out. You know, I was only 10 or 11 years old. I didn't have the instructions. And, like, the game seemed cool, but I just felt like I just don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. And it's a game I've never really gone back to, but I would like to, because it, you know, it's a cool game that obviously spawned a very popular series. So, you know, it would be cool to check out the first one more, but I just have never gotten around to it or had time. Now, down here we have Bionic Commando. Now, I can't really speak to how popular Bionic Commando was back then, just because I didn't have it and I didn't know anybody else that had it. And so that was pretty much my whole world at the time. But Bionic Commando appears on pretty much every list of the best games on the Nintendo, and that's definitely well-deserved. Now, this was an arcade game originally, or I should say there was an arcade game called Bionic Commando. This is a completely different game. It has the same gameplay mechanic, but all the levels are completely different. And the reason it's called Bionic Commando, and this kind of gets back to something we talked about in the last Let's Read, the Mega Play issue. I said I didn't understand why mercs wasn't called Commando 2, and I think this might explain why. Here in the US, when they released Bionic Commando into the arcades, they presented it as a sequel to Commando, the original Commando, and so that's why it's Bionic Commando. Like in the arcades, the main character is Super Joe, which is the same main character from Commando. And here in the home version, they sort of changed the story, and now you're not Super Joe, you're going to go rescue Super Joe. Probably the most noteworthy thing about Bionic Commando is sort of the interesting gameplay mechanic in which you cannot jump, but instead you have like your robotic arm that you can basically use as a grappling hook. And I could see if you've never played Bionic Commando and you just fire it up because you've heard all these things about it and you want to check it out, I could really see that gameplay mechanic being very off-putting. And you might play it and be like, I don't like it, and turn it off. And you'd really be doing yourself a disservice. The game takes a little bit of getting used to, but once you get used to it, it's so worth it. It's a very good game, and it's very deserving of all the accolades that it gets. So don't let yourself be turned off by sort of its unique gameplay mechanic, which you may find frustrating at first because you're playing an action platform game, and so just you want to jump because you're just used to being able to jump, but in this game you can't jump. So next we have City Connection. City Connection's kind of an interesting game. It was put out by Jalico. I don't know how to explain how this game works. Like it scrolls left to right, and like you're driving a car and you cannot stop. You can speed up and slow down a little bit, but you can't stop. But you can jump somehow. Like I don't know how that works. Like maybe like turbo boost from Knight Rider. But you have all these levels. Like there's 3 levels plus sort of the ground level, and you have to move between the levels and sort of fill in all of the little dots or the little spaces. Like I think the way it puts it is that you're painting the road. And so you'll notice that the levels seem like hollowed out or whatever, like they're blue, like a blue grid, and as you drive over them they fill in white. And the point is that you have to fill everything in white. And so you have to drive over every surface in each level basically. And I guess it's called City Connection because the backgrounds change, like it's New York City and then it's Paris and it's London, etc., etc. There, for some reason, are cop cars everywhere that aren't really chasing you. They're just like getting in the way. But then you can basically throw an oil can at them, which will make them spin out. And then if you hit them, they like fly off the screen. So I don't really know, like, why are they cop cars? Like, why do you care? They're not chasing you. I didn't really have a problem with the cop cars. Like, to me, the hardest part of the game is that they're what at least look like cats, and they show up in the road, and if you hit a cat, that's like you lose your life. So don't hit a cat, which is good life advice as well. I had a harder time for some reason avoiding the cats because they would just like pop up randomly. But it is a cool game. I mean, it's just an arcade style game. It doesn't really have any depth to it. Once again, I would say back then it would have been a good rental game, not something you'd want to buy unless it was like out of a clearance bin. Below that, you've got Akari Warriors 2 Victory Road. They didn't learn any of their lessons from the original Akari Warriors. This game still sucks. When it starts off, somehow it's taking place in space, for whatever that's worth. In some ways, I feel like the game is actually worse. Maybe somebody else disagrees. I will freely admit I have not spent that much time playing this game because I just don't like these games. Apparently the third one is good, but the first and second one are not. All right, on the next page here, this is just Pack Watch, which are like, these are games that are coming out in sort of the more distant future, so they don't have a whole lot of information. So we're not going to spend too much time looking at this, but just to give you a sense of the games that people were looking forward to having come out in the middle of '88. Here you've got Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. They just have like one sentence. It says, it will definitely be available in stores by October. Well, it ended up, I believe, not coming out until December, so it didn't quite make that deadline. Here you've got Blaster Master, which is a very well-regarded game. Lee Trevino's Fighting Golf. Actually an underrated golf game on the Nintendo, I'll say. I thought that game was pretty good. Here's Platoon, which, like I said, we talked about. I can't believe they would make a kids game based on Platoon, the movie. Not a kid-friendly movie at all. Marble Madness, I remember renting that one. Really cool game. Of course, Marble Madness came out on seemingly every platform back then. It was on the Nintendo, it was on the Sega Master System, the Genesis, the Lynx. Not sure if it came out on the Game Gear, but I'd be kind of shocked if it didn't. It was in development actually for the TurboGrafx 16, but never released. And then of course, ubiquitous on home computers back then. Now in the arcades, Marble Madness had like a trackball that you could use that made the game a lot, I don't want to say easier, but you know, it kind of made more sense because you were using a trackball to roll a ball around the screen, but still really cool at home. And this was the kind of game that, you know, your parents would approve of because, you know, at least that's what I remember. Like the game wasn't violent or anything, and so like my mom thought like, oh, that's a very like nice game or whatever. And then down here you've got Simon's Quest, Castlevania 2, which of course most people don't care for, and probably rightfully so. And then over here you have Life Force by Konami, which is an awesome, awesome game. This was kind of like their follow-up, if you will, to Gradius. Not a sequel to Gradius, but it sort of takes place in the same world. You're still flying the Vic Viper. But it isn't Gradius 2 because that's a separate game. But Gradius and Life Force, for me at least, are two of the best games on the NES. Here you've got a players poll contest. That's exciting. And this was basically just, they were trying to get kids to fill out the players poll and send it in. For reasons that you'll see coming up, just because they were trying to figure out what games kids liked the most. And so I guess to get kids to do that, they had this contest, which is basically just a drawing based on whoever sent in their players poll cards. And you can see here that the grand prize is 10 Nintendo games of your choice, which would be a pretty awesome grand prize. I don't know. I'd be curious to, you know, if I could ever like somehow talk to the person that won that would be cool. I'd be curious like what game somebody would get. And then second prize where they had 10 copies of Super Mario Brothers 2 to give away, so that's pretty awesome. It looks like a pretty cool 80s TV he's got down there too. That of course is Howard Phillips, by the way. I think that's might be the first time in this issue that you actually see him instead of a cartoon version of him. And then third prize, they had 50 of these Nintendo Power jerseys, which they are quick to point out are not available in stores. The only way to get them would be to win this contest. Would be pretty neat to have one of those, though. And then next here we have the NES Journal, which is like news stories about Nintendo stuff. Like the first one here, they got World News, and this is talking about Dragon Quest III, which, the entire Dragon Quest series was extremely popular in Japan, which is their point here. I don't know how well you can see this picture. Maybe I can like lift it up. Looks like a black and white shot, but it's just showing people lined up on the day the game was being released, like waiting outside the store to get their copy. I mean, that's how popular the game was. And interesting that they point out in here that it's rather odd to find American-born sword and magic games making one great hit after another in the eastern country of Japan. And I'd never really thought about that. You know, like the early Final Fantasy games and the Dragon Quest games were really sort of based in the Dungeons and Dragons type of world. And so it's not immediately obvious that that would have been popular in Japan versus, you know, games based on their own mythology and whatnot. So that's pretty cool. Dragon Quest, all four games, Dragon Quest games for the Famicom did come out in the U.S. as Dragon Warrior. But, you know, at least the third and the fourth releases had a more limited release, and for that reason are fairly pricey. Then here we've got Focus on an arcade machine, in this case Vindicators. Down here they're talking about a couple books. Well, just plugging a couple books, really. The official Nintendo Player's Guide I've talked about before. Here they're telling you that you can buy it straight from them for $12 instead of buying it at the store for $20. The Player's Guide really was just a guide to like every Nintendo game that was out. Like that included tips and tricks, but also just sort of reviews or overviews of all these games, maybe to give you an idea of like what games were available and what you might want. I would have loved to have one of those when I was a kid. Unfortunately, I didn't. And then over here you've got Zelda tips and tactics. So this was just like a separate guide to help you with Legend of Zelda. And then down here under events, it says Konami awards a Top Gun title. So Konami had some kind of contest, like a skill contest, to see who could get the top score in their game Top Gun. And the first place prize was actually $5,000, which is pretty crazy, especially in 1988. I mean, that's the equivalent of it, at least $10,000 now, right? So to give that away to somebody just for being good at a Nintendo game, that's pretty cool. And especially because, the grand prize here, 10 Nintendo games, that's about a $500 value, which is already pretty good. I'm not complaining. But to go from that to $5,000, which went to Devin the Devil White of Minneapolis, Minnesota, that's pretty good. So, of course, back then, if you were 12 years old or something back then and you won $5,000, your parents were going to step in and, make sure that went into like a college fund or something else. They weren't going to let you go below $5,000. Rightfully so. And then continuing on with the NES Journal section, so sort of non-video game or semi-video game news. Here you got like what's popular at the movies. I think this is especially cool to check out now because it gives you sort of a sense of what else was popular at the time. I'm sorry they don't talk about music or TV, but it's cool they're at least talking about the movies. You can see here they've got 3 movies they're talking about this month. The first one is Vibes, which has Cyndi Lauper and Jeff Goldblum in it. Now, to be honest, I've never heard of Vibes. I was watching movies back then, so I don't know how that one slipped past. And certainly Cyndi Lauper was very popular in the 80s, although I might argue that in 88, her popularity was probably on the decline a little bit. But Big Top Pee-wee, they call it here Pee-wee's Big Top, but it ended up being released as Big Top Pee-wee. This is a movie I actually saw in the movie theater. It was Pee-wee Herman's, I guess, second movie after Pee-wee's Big Adventure. And, he like lives on a farm and like a circus comes by or something. I don't really remember. I don't think I ever actually saw it again. But probably the biggest thing I remember about Big Top Pee-wee is that it had Valeria Golino in it, who I would definitely say I had a crush on when I was a kid. And then down here we've got 8 Men Out, which I'm not really sure how much that would be of interest to like an 11-year-old kid. Of course, 8 Men Out chronicles the 1919 World Series, which the Chicago White Sox famously threw because they made a deal with a bunch of gamblers because they were heavily favored to win that World Series. They made this deal. They were going to throw the series. They all got paid. Some of them, famously Shoeless Joe Jackson was banned for life from baseball. Kind of a cool thing. This movie features a lot of up-and-coming stars. It's got Charlie Sheen, John Cusack, D.B. Sweeney, Christopher Lloyd from Back to the Future. And then over here, this was something else that they did regularly. And it was something that I would say other video game magazines also copied, which was, getting these celebrities into the magazine. And here we have Kirk and Candace Cameron. Now, of course, Kirk Cameron was famous for his role on Growing Pains as Mike Seaver. And then Candace Cameron, of course, was on Full House. She was DJ Tanner on Full House. And so, you don't know how much of this was actually like somebody, like a writer for Nintendo Power, actually interviewing these people, or how much of it was just something supplied by a publicist. But, they were both teenagers at the time, or actually Candace Cameron was probably, it says here she was 12, and Kirk was 17. And they're just talking about how much, of course, they love Nintendo games, and they play them on set all the time. And here's some of their favorite games and the things they like and don't like. So, it was just an obvious ploy by Nintendo. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just, the whole point was like, hey, here's some stars that you like. Here's the games they like. Maybe you should go get those games. Which, like I said, there's nothing wrong with doing that, but whatever. Kirk's talking about how many times he's beaten Super Mario Brothers, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Over here we get to Mailbox. Oh, here's what I was talking about. I've read that Howard Phillips has close to 300 games for the NES. I would like to know if it would be possible for you to send me some of the names of the games he has. Like, why? And then he wants to know if they're ever going to be made available to the public. So that goes back to what I was saying about how Howard was, at least in theory, playing all these Famicom games and deciding, which games were good enough that we were going to get them here in the United States. And then the editor or whoever. Oh, he also asked, sorry, I almost forgot. Could you tell me the exact name of the theme song from Spy Hunter? Which, of course, that was was Peter Gunn. But, I loved that music back then, too. But they're talking about, it says, be patient. there are already over 100 games available for the NES. And I was kind of surprised when I read that in 88 there were only 100 games for the NES. It really gives you a sense of where we are in the NES timeline, because the NES had something like, I think, 660 games come out over the course of its lifetime. And so here we are in the middle of 88, when the system has been actually out for 3 years in this country, or almost 3 years, and there's still only 100 games, or roughly 100 games. This lady, this sounds so made up, someone named June Mayfield, that's like the most stereotypical old lady name, tells this whole story about how her grandson was bringing by his Nintendo, and she was playing it with him, but then he left and took the Nintendo with him. And, it says here she was playing Commando, and he left with his Nintendo, and so she convinced her husband for them to buy their own Nintendo. I guess just trying to show, Nintendo appeals to all ages. This one was kind of funny. I like this one. It's from somebody in Maiden, Massachusetts. And the letter says, "My friends and I have a club called the Videoizers. Here are a few suggestions for some other clubs. Try saving up weekly for a new tape every month. So far, our club has 13 tapes." I thought that was pretty funny, because whenever I hear that, I always associate that with out-of-touch adults or old people. Who calls them tapes? But, here's some kid calling them, we're getting some new Nintendo tapes. So I thought that was pretty funny. In our club, we save a few dollars a week for extra money to call the Nintendo hotline. A friendly game counselor kindly helps us out when we have trouble on something. Well, whatever. I thought it was funny, A, the Videoizers, and B, that they called them game tapes. Somebody else down here, Double Dribble is super awesome. Yes, it is. I was talking about my best friend's brother, Jordan, and how much he used to play Bases Loaded. The other game he played nonstop was Double Dribble. Somebody else here said, now this I didn't realize, so this was interesting. My friend has recently bought your basic set. In doing so, he acquired the official Nintendo Player's Guide. If it's possible, may I request one? And I had totally forgotten that there was the basic set. When I think of the Nintendo bundles from back then, you think of the deluxe set, which came with Rob the Robot, and then you think of the control deck set, which is what I had. And then, of course, the action set came out later that had the Mario Brothers Duck Hunt cartridge, and then you got the Zapper. But I had totally forgotten that there was the basic set, which didn't have a pack-in game. And I guess, I didn't really realize this, I guess it came with a copy of the official Nintendo Player's Guide, because that, I guess, would help you select what games you wanted to get. Here we have the NES Achievers section, and this was just, kids could write in, and I guess they had to supply a picture. Like here it says, first we need evidence of your great achievement, so be sure to capture it on film, and they give you some tips on how to best take a picture of your screen. But the whole point was just that, if you got a high score, you could send it in and you'd see your name in the magazine. And whenever I read these old magazines, I always just quickly scan for my hometown and just happen to see if I find anybody I know. And the reason for that is I don't remember which issue, but I actually did find somebody I knew, when I was in high school. He was a friend of mine in high school, or an acquaintance. And I found his name in one of these old issues. And there actually is somebody in here from my hometown, but I don't recognize the name, so not somebody that I knew. Here we've got Video Spotlight, Events with Readers. And it says, these players wrote in to tell us about their video game prowess. We think you'll agree they all qualify as power players. And the one thing I wanted to say that I thought was cool, I'm not going to spend too much time on this section, but the one thing that I thought was cool is that if you read these letters, most of these letters are kids writing in talking about somebody else instead of themselves. Like the first letter says, our club is called the NES Masters. We know right off who our power player is. His name is Ace Ebb. He writes to Nintendo all the time, telling them of his accomplishments on games. His hobbies are playing Nintendo games, period. He has no pets. Instead, he plays Nintendo all day. And they go on to talk about some of his achievements and whatnot. But it was the same thing with the next letter. It's of our group, it's this kid, Mike. And I just thought that was cool, because you would think that most people would write in to talk about themselves. And some people do, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I just thought it was cool that they would talk about other kids they knew. Here we've got the top 30.
And I'm going to actually skip ahead to the next page to explain to you how they put this together. So here's the list of the top 30. And then the next page here, they have the players' picks, which are based off of the players' poll we talked about. And then you have the pros picks, which I believe are based off of the Nintendo game counselors and what they thought were the best games. And then you have the dealers' picks, which are obviously based off of dealers off of the various stores and whatnot. And they take these three lists and put them together, and that's how they come up with the top 30. I guess I don't really know what the point necessarily of this list is supposed to be, except that if you were trying to figure out what games you wanted to buy next, you could look at something like this and you would see like what were some of the top rated games. I mean, they don't really do game reviews in Nintendo Power, so it's like, if they feature a game, you'd say, okay, well, that must be a good game, or at least you get a sense of what the game is like. But other than that, it's not like they're going to put a game in here and say, yeah, this game's bad, don't get it. So it's almost more like if you see a game at the store and they don't cover it in Nintendo Power, or it's not even on the top 30 list, maybe there's a reason for that and you shouldn't get it. So for that reason, it would have been helpful if I had Nintendo Power back in the day, but unfortunately I didn't. Not really surprising to see Legend of Zelda at the top of the list, although by this time the game had been out for a year. Mike Tyson's Punch-Out second, Metroid third. I'm trying to look for games. I'm kind of surprised Ice Hockey is 7, but I know ice hockey was very popular and still is in parts of this country. I like ice hockey, but out here in California, it's really not that popular. And I'm a little bit surprised to see Rad Racer at number 8. Not because I don't think it's a good game, but I just don't remember it being particularly popular when I was a kid. And Top Gun at 9, that was a popular game. I had a friend who had it. We used to play that one a lot. Although, interestingly, I want to say the Top Gun movie came out in 86. 86 or 87. Boy, I think it was 86. I should have looked it up. So I'm kind of surprised that a game based on it would be popular in 88. I don't know what else is in here. Side Pocket, I wouldn't expect a game based on pool to be quite so popular. But here's the first Mega Man, Russian Attack. Goonies 2, kind of surprised that is that high, because Goonies 2 is really not a game that I feel like is that well regarded now. I guess it's okay if you have a guide for it, but otherwise it's sort of not obvious what you're supposed to be doing. We talked about that already. And then they talk about what's coming up in the next issue. Simon's Quest, The Adventure of Bayou Billy, and Bionic Commando. I'm not sure if I actually have issue 2 of Nintendo Power. I'd be curious to read the Bionic Commando section. And then here you've got a little message from Howard Phillips. And then back here you've got, now like I said, this was your last chance to subscribe. So that's why it's even saying don't be left behind. Like, you've been getting Fun Club news for free, and then you got this for free, but if you don't hop on board, that's the end. You're getting nothing else for free. And it wasn't a bad deal. I mean, it was $15. At this time, it was a bi-monthly magazine. And, that's about it. I mean, this subscription card is still here. The other one's gone. I think the other one actually had the player's poll on it. Maybe that's why it's gone. But that's about it. And then on the back cover, just sort of an ad here for Nintendo in general, showing some of their most popular games. For some reason, the original owner X'd through a bunch of these. I'm not sure why. Maybe I already have that, or I don't want that. I don't know which. But anyway, that's about it. So that is Nintendo Power issue number 1, or they called them volumes. So Nintendo Power volume number 1 from July and August of 1988. Now, I was going to put a segment at the beginning of this episode on the history of Nintendo Power, but as this episode is already an hour long, I didn't want to do anything to make it any longer. So instead, I'm going to direct you to the awesome book Console Wars by Blake Harris, which has an entire chapter in it on the history of Nintendo of America, including the establishment of the Nintendo Fun Club and the creation of Nintendo Power. So if you haven't had a chance to read that book yet, you can check it out using the link in the video description. That's going to do it for this episode of Classic Gaming Quarterly. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.